Close your eyes for a second. Seriously, just for a moment. I want you to transport yourself back in time. It is nighttime. The wind is howling, and it feels like it's cutting right through your coat. That is, if you're lucky enough to even have a coat.
It's freezing, something like 20 degrees below zero. You're in St. Petersburg, Russia. The year is 1917.
And you aren't just cold. You're starving. You've been standing in a line for bread since 4 o'clock this morning.
Your feet are just numb, your stomach is cramping, and you look around at the people next to you, and they aren't, soldiers or criminals. They're mothers, they're factory workers, elderly neighbors.
All shivering, all just waiting for a loaf of bread that might not even be there when you get to the front of the line.
Now turn your head. Just a few streets away, you can see this massive golden building just glowing in the night. The Winter Palace.
Inside, the fireplaces are roaring. There's champagne, there's caviar, fine silk. And there sits a man, the Tsar, who genuinely believes that God himself, not the people, but God appointed him to be your father, your ruler, your absolute master.
And this is the central tension we're unpacking today. If you were standing in that snow, watching your children go hungry while the ruler lived in that palace, how far would you go?
Right. Would you just protest? Or would you be willing to, burn the whole system down?
Welcome to the deep dive.
Today we're tackling one of the most explosive events in human history, the Russian Revolution and the rise of the Soviet Union.
It's a massive topic. We're really looking at how a centuries-old empire, ruled by a czar, collapsed and transformed into the world's first communist state.
First under Vladimir Lenin, and later Joseph Stalin.
And we aren't just reciting dates and battles here. We've got a stack of research textbooks, summaries, historical accounts that help us get at the big theme underneath it all.
And that theme is the clash between, between individualism and collectivism.
Right. This is really a story about what happens when a society decides that the group, the collective, matters more than the individual. We're going to explore how a really genuine desire for equality led to one of the most powerful, but also one of the most oppressive regimes in history.
Okay, before we jump in, we need to make sure we're all on the same page with a couple of big concepts you're going to hear a lot. First one, ideology.
Think of ideology as a pair of glasses. It's a system of beliefs and values that, it determines how you see the world.
It answers the big questions like, what are humans like? And how should we live together?
Exactly. And for the people in our story, their ideology wasn't just an opinion. It was almost a religion. It was something worth living for and definitely something worth dying for.
And the second word is autocracy.
Autocracy. It's a form of government where one person has absolute power.
No checks, no balances.
None. What they say goes. And that is exactly what Russia was under the Tsars.
So let's light the fuse on this powder keg. Let's look at Russia before 1917. What did this place actually look like? Because I think we often picture it just like the rest of Europe, but it really wasn't, was it?
Not at all. To understand the revolution, you have to respect the geography. The Russian Empire was colossal.
Just huge.
It stretched across Eurasia, from Eastern Europe all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It covered 1/6 of the Earth's land surface. But despite its size, it was, technologically speaking, way behind the rest of Europe.
The research describes it as backward, which sounds kind of harsh, but it's accurate for the time, right?
It is. While England and Germany were building these massive factories and complex rail networks, Russia was still largely stuck in the past. It felt almost medieval.
And the social structure reflected that. It was incredibly rigid.
Picture a pyramid. At the very, very top, you have the Tsar Nicholas II. He's an absolute monarch. He controls social, political, and economic life.
And just below him, you've got a tiny layer of nobility, these wealthy landowners who live very, very comfortable lives.
And then at the bottom, holding the whole thing up,
Peasants.
millions and millions of them, something like 80% of the entire population. Now, technically, serfdom, which was basically a form of slavery where you were tied to the land, had been abolished.
Right back in 1861 by the previous Tsar, Alexander II.
Yeah, but freedom is a pretty loose term here. The peasants were still incredibly poor, they were uneducated, and they were working land they didn't really own for landlords who took most of the profit.
It's hard to overstate how different their lives were from the elite. They lived in these village communes called mirs. They had their own courts, their own customs.
They were almost like a different nation living inside the empire. And for the people who did move to the cities, to work in the few factories that existed, it wasn't much better.
11-hour workdays, terrible pay, really dangerous conditions. It was a pressure cooker, just waiting to explode.
And it almost did. In 1905, we call this the First Russian Revolution, or sometimes the dress rehearsal.
This brings us to a really tragic event known as Bloody Sunday. And it's tragic because it didn't start as a riot. It started as a plea for help.
That's the heartbreaking part. In January 1905, thousands of workers marched to the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg. And they weren't carrying guns or anything. They were carrying religious icons and pictures of the Tsar.
They were led by a priest, a guy named Father Gapon. They just wanted better working conditions, fair wages, basic stuff.
They actually thought that if the Tsar just knew how bad things were, he would fix it. They had this nickname for him, Little Father.
But the Little Father wasn't home, and his soldiers panicked. They looked at this massive sea of people and they opened fire.
Just fired directly into the crowd. Hundreds of people were killed or wounded.
And that just shattered the illusion, didn't it?
Completely. The people realized the Tsar wasn't going to protect them. The myth of the benevolent ruler died on the streets that day. This kicked off mass strikes all over the country.
So, to survive, Nicholas II had to make a concession. He created something called the Duma.
The Duma was supposed to be a parliament, an elected group of representatives, and it sounded like democracy was finally coming to Russia.
It sounded like it.
But it was a fake democracy. The Tsar retained absolute power. If the Duma disagreed with him on something, he would just dissolve it, send everyone home.
He just refused to share power.
Yeah.
And that stubbornness is so crucial to what happens next.
Because then comes the breaking point, 1914, World War I.
Russia enters the war with, numerically, the largest army in the world. But remember that backwardness we talked about.
Their equipment was terrible. We have these accounts of soldiers being sent into battle without rifles.
Seriously?
Yeah, waiting for a comrade to fall so they could pick up his weapon. They lacked boots, they lacked ammunition. It was a disaster.
The casualties were just horrific. Millions killed or wounded. And the leadership.
This is where Nicholas II makes a fatal error, a really catastrophic mistake. He decides to go to the front lines and take personal command of the army.
Which I guess on one level sounds brave, like a warrior king or something.
Maybe, but politically, it was suicide. Before, if the war went badly, he could blame his generals.
But now?
Now, every defeat, every dead soldier was personally his fault. And by leaving the capital, he left a huge power vacuum.
So who's running the country while he's gone?
His wife, Empress Alexandra, and she was heavily, heavily influenced by a mystic monk named Rasputin.
Oh, Rasputin. He's a whole other deep dive.
He really is, but the public perception was that a German-born queen and this crazy monk were running the show while the Tsar was losing the war. It was terrible for morale.
Meanwhile, back home, things are just falling apart. With all the men at war and the transport system totally clogged with military supplies, food wasn't getting to the cities.
Prices skyrocketed. People were starving.
And that brings us right back to that frozen street corner in St. Petersburg, which, by the way, they had renamed Petrograd to sound less German during the war.
Right. It's 1917, and the powder keg finally explodes.
It's so important to note that there were two distinct revolutions in 1917. The first one happens in February. And honestly, it wasn't planned by some political mastermind. It was spontaneous.
It started with women. It was International Women's Day. Women who had been standing in those bread lines, exhausted and angry, just started demonstrating.
And then the factory workers joined them. And soon, the streets were full of protesters shouting, "Down with the Tsar," and bread.
Now, usually the Tsar would just order the army to crush the protests like they did on Bloody Sunday, and he did. He gave that order.
But this time, something was different.
Yeah. The soldiers looked at the crowd, and they saw their own wives, their mothers, their sisters. They were sick of the war, sick of the hunger. So instead of shooting the protesters,
They mutinied. They joined them. They turned their guns on their officers.
and that is the turning point. Without the army, the Tsar had no power. Nicholas II was forced to abdicate, to give up the throne. Just like that, 300 years of Romanov family rule was over in a matter of days.
So who takes over? This is where it gets really messy.
Yeah.
You had a temporary group called the Provisional Government taking charge.
It was led eventually by a guy named Alexander Kerensky. And on paper, this was a good thing. It was a move toward liberal democracy, freedom of speech, assembly, religion.
But they weren't the only ones with power, were they?
Not even close. At the exact same time, workers and soldiers formed their own councils called Soviets. The most powerful one was the Petrograd Soviet.
So you had this really weird situation called dual power.
Exactly. The provisional government had the formal authority, But the Soviets had the actual power because they controlled the trains, the telegraphs, the troops. They could shut the city down if they wanted to.
And the provisional government made two massive mistakes that just doomed them.
Huge mistakes. First, they refused to give the land to the peasants immediately. They said, oh, we have to wait for a proper election.
And the second one, and this was the killer, they decided to stay in World War I.
They wanted to honor their alliances with Britain and France. They were worried about German domination. But the Russian people hated the war. They were dying for nothing. So the provisional government became unpopular very, very quickly.
And waiting in the wings, just watching all this chaos unfold, is a man named Vladimir Lenin.
Enter the Bolsheviks. So Lenin was this radical intellectual. He'd been in exile in Switzerland for years because the Tsar's police wanted him arrested.
But now with the Tsar gone, he wanted back in. And ironically, the Germans helped him get there.
Wait, hold on. The Germans, weren't they at war with Russia?
Exactly. The Germans knew Lenin was an anti-war radical. They figured if they sent him back to Russia, he would cause so much trouble that Russia would drop out of the war.
It was a strategic move. Winston Churchill later described it as the Germans transporting Lenin like a plague bacillus in a sealed truck.
They literally sealed the train so he couldn't get out and infect Germany with his ideas on the way through.
Precisely. And it worked. Lenin arrives at Finland Station in Petrograd, and he doesn't talk about complex Marxist theories. He uses a slogan. A simple, brilliant marketing slogan that resonated with every single angry person in Russia. Peace, land, bread. It covers everything. Peace.
Yeah.
End the hated war with Germany immediately.
Land. Take the land from the rich nobles and give it directly to the peasants.
And bread. Feed the starving cities. It was genius.
The provisional government couldn't promise any of that. Lenin promised all of it. He also coined the phrase, all power to the Soviets. And remember, Soviet just means council.
So he was saying, forget the politicians in suits. We, the workers' councils, should be the ones running things. It was incredibly appealing.
And by October or November, depending on which calendar you're using, the Bolsheviks were ready to make their move.
Now, unlike the February Revolution, which was that chaotic mass uprising, this was different. This was a strategic coup d'etat.
The October Revolution. Lenin and the Bolsheviks, along with their armed Red Guards, moved with precision. They didn't just run screaming into the streets. They took over the telegraph offices, the train stations, the bridges.
They seized the nervous system of the city.
Then they stormed the Winter Palace, where the provisional government was basically hiding out.
And stormed might be a bit dramatic. It was actually surprisingly quiet. They walked in, arrested the government, and took control. Just like that, the world's first communist government was born.
But taking power is one thing.
Keeping it is something else entirely. And not everyone was happy about the communists or Bolsheviks taking over.
Far from it. This triggered a brutal civil war that lasted from 1918 to 1921. Russia was just torn apart. On one side, you had the Red Army, the Bolsheviks.
And on the other side,
the White Army. Now, the Whites weren't a unified group. This is really important to understand.
Yeah, they were a mix of everyone who hated the Bolsheviks. You had royalists who wanted the Tsar back. You had Democrats, landlords, and even foreign troops.
The U.S., Britain, and Japan actually sent soldiers to Russia to help the Whites.
They were terrified of communism spreading, this Red Scare.
So why did the Reds win? The Whites had foreign help and a lot of experienced generals.
A few key reasons. First, geography. The Reds controlled the center of the country, Moscow and Petrograd and all the railways. They could move troops and supplies quickly. The Whites were scattered all around the edges.
So they were disorganized.
Very. And second, unity. The Reds had a single fanatical goal. The Whites, well, they hated each other almost as much as they hated the Reds. And finally, you had leadership. Leon Trotsky organized the Red Army into a ruthless, effective fighting machine.
It was a nasty, bloody conflict. And it had a really grim consequence for the former Tsar. The Bolsheviks were holding Nicholas and his family prisoner.
As the White Army got close to where they were being held, Lenin and his circle made a very cold calculation.
They couldn't risk the Tsar being rescued, could they?
No. If he was rescued, he'd become a symbol, a rallying point for the anti-communists. So, in a basement in a city called Yekaterinburg, the Bolsheviks executed the entire family.
The Tsar, his wife, and all 5 of their children.
It was a signal. A brutal signal that there was no going back. The old world was dead.
And meanwhile, to win this war, Lenin implemented a new policy, an economic policy called war communism.
And the name tells you a lot. The goal was to win the war, The goal was to feed the Red Army, no matter the cost.
The method was brutal. The state seized all surplus grain from the peasants.
Yeah.
If you grew more than you personally needed to survive, the government took it.
They employed these requisition squads who would go into villages with guns and just take everything. They also banned all private trade and took over all the factories.
And this it backfired spectacularly.
It did. You have to think about the psychology here.
Right, so imagine you're a farmer. If you work really hard and produce 10 bags of wheat, the government takes 9 and leaves you with 1.
But if you only work a little bit and produce 1 bag, you still get to keep that 1 bag.
So why would you break your back working if the result is exactly the same?
You wouldn't. So the peasants stopped producing surplus. They only grew what they needed to eat. Production just collapsed. The economy tanked. Industrial output dropped by 50%.
And then came the famine.
Millions starved. It was a complete disaster. It got so bad that even the sailors at Kronstadt, a naval base near Petrograd, rebelled.
And these guys had been Lenin's biggest supporters back in 1917.
His most loyal troops. But by 1921, they were rising up, demanding Soviets without Bolsheviks. They wanted the democracy they thought they'd been promised.
That rebellion really scared Lenin, didn't it?
It terrified him. He was a radical, but he was also a pragmatist. He realized that if he didn't change course, the communists would be overthrown by their own people.
So in 1921, he does a complete U-turn. He introduces something called the New Economic Policy, or the NEP.
And this is fascinating because it's basically a temporary return to capitalism.
It is. Lenin called it 1 step backward, 2 steps forward. Under the NEP, the state still controlled the big industries. Banking, steel, the commanding heights of the economy.
But small businesses could open again. Money was reintroduced. And crucially, peasants were allowed to sell their surplus grain on the open market.
They still paid a tax, of course, but they could make a profit. And suddenly, there was an incentive to work hard again.
And it worked, almost immediately. Food returned to the markets, the economy stabilized. You had these NEP men, small businessmen, who started making money. It saved the Soviet Union from collapse.
But a lot of the hardline communists hated it, right?
They absolutely hated it. They thought it was a betrayal of the revolution, a step back toward the world they had just destroyed.
But then, just as things are stabilizing, everything changes again. In 1924, Vladimir Lenin dies.
And this creates a massive power vacuum. I mean, in a monarchy, you know who's next, it's the son.
Yeah.
But in a revolutionary party, there are no rules, it's a free-for-all.
There were 2 main guys fighting for the top spot. In one corner, you have Leon Trotsky.
Trotsky was the intellectual, the war hero who led the Red Army, a brilliant, charismatic speaker. He believed in world revolution, that Russia's job was to help workers in other countries rise up and overthrow their governments.
And in the other corner, Joseph Stalin.
Stalin was different. He wasn't a flashy intellectual. He was the general secretary of the party, a bureaucrat. His job was to manage the paperwork and assign people to jobs.
Which sounds incredibly boring.
It sounds boring, but it was incredibly powerful because Stalin was the guy who gave everyone their promotions. He was building this massive network of loyalty quietly behind the scenes. While Trotsky was making big speeches, Stalin was making friends in high places.
And Lenin actually saw this coming, didn't he?
He did. Just before he died, Lenin wrote a document that's now known as his testament. In it, he warned the party about Stalin.
What did he say?
He said Stalin was too rude, too power-hungry, and had accumulated way too much authority. He basically said, you need to remove Stalin from his post.
That seems pretty clear. So why didn't they fire him?
Stalin was just too clever. He suppressed that testament. He made sure it wasn't read out to the whole party. And then he outmaneuvered Trotsky. He painted Trotsky's idea of world revolution as dangerous and reckless.
And he proposed his own idea instead.
Socialism in one country. Let's forget the world for now, he said, and focus on making Russia strong first.
And that appealed to people who were just tired of war and chaos.
Exactly. So Stalin wins. He has Trotsky exiled, kicked out of the country, and eventually, years later, has him assassinated with an ice axe in Mexico.
And this brings up one of the most chilling aspects of Stalin's rise, the rewriting of reality. Stalin didn't just defeat his enemies, he erased them.
We're talking about damnatio memoria, condemning the memory.
Exactly. We have sources showing these famous photos. There's one of Lenin giving a speech to a crowd and Trotsky standing right there on the steps next to him.
A famous historical photo.
But after Trotsky was exiled, Stalin had the photo doctored. They used airbrushes and scalpel blades to physically remove Trotsky from the negative.
So in the new history books, it looked like Trotsky was never even there.
It went further than that. Regular citizens would go through their own family photo albums and cut out the faces of relatives who had been arrested, just in case the secret police raided their house. You didn't want to be seen with an enemy of the people.
That is just, it's psychological terror. And speaking of terror, let's look at what Stalin actually did once he had total control. Lenin was gone, the moderate NEP was gone. Stalin wanted total control and rapid modernization.
Stalin looked at the West and was terrified. He gave a famous speech where he said, "We are 50 or 100 years behind the advanced countries. We must make good this distance in 10 years. Either we do it or we shall be crushed."
So he launched the 5-year plans.
They were massive, centrally planned economic goals set by an agency called Gosplan. And the focus was entirely on heavy industry.
Steel, coal, electricity, machinery. They built entire cities from scratch, like Magnitogorsk, a huge steel city in the Ural Mountains.
But notice what's missing from that list.
Consumer goods?
Exactly. Shoes, clothes, furniture.
The state didn't care if you had comfortable boots. They cared if the nation had steel for tanks and railways. They set these impossible quotas. If a factory was told to produce 100 tons of steel, they had to do it.
And if they didn't?
The managers might be arrested as saboteurs or wreckers and shot. This created a culture of lying. Factories would produce really low-quality steel just to hit the weight target, or they'd just lie about the numbers.
But to feed all the workers in these new cities, Stalin needed grain. And he didn't want to deal with independent farmers anymore. He wanted total control.
And this leads us to the darkest chapter of this whole story, collectivization.
Stalin decided that individual farms were inefficient and capitalist. So he ordered all peasants to give up their land, their animals, their tools, and join these massive state-run farms called collectives, or kolkhozy.
I mean, just try to imagine that. Someone comes to your house and says, "This isn't yours anymore. You work for us now." The peasants absolutely hated it.
Especially the wealthier peasants, who are known as kulaks.
And wealthy is a relative term. Sometimes it just meant they owned a couple of cows or could afford to hire a hand. But they resisted. They burned their crops and killed their livestock rather than give them to the state.
Stalin's response was merciless. He launched a campaign of dekulakization,
which basically meant liquidating them as a class. Kulaks were rounded up, shot, or sent to the gulag's forced labor camps in Siberia. Millions of people were deported.
And in places like Ukraine, where resistance was particularly high, the state used hunger as a weapon.
They seized absolutely all the food. They had squads go house to house using these long metal rods to probe the ground to see if peasants had buried sacks of grain.
They even passed a law called the Law of Spikelets. If a starving peasant was caught picking up a few stalks of wheat left behind in a field after the harvest, they could be shot or imprisoned for 10 years.
It was designed to create a man-made famine, and it's known today as the Holodomor.
It was illegal to eat your own crops until the state's quota was met.
The result was apocalyptic. We don't have the exact numbers, but it's estimated somewhere between 7 and 10 million people died of starvation.
And the horrific irony, while people were eating bark and grass just to survive, the Soviet Union was exporting grain to foreign countries to buy machinery for its factories.
It really highlights that clash we talked about at the start. Collectivism taken to its most brutal extreme. The individual life meant absolutely nothing. The goal of the state meant everything.
And this terror wasn't just for peasants. In the late 1930s, Stalin launched the Great Purge. He became consumed by paranoia. He saw enemies everywhere.
He turned on his own party, he staged these elaborate show trials, and executed his own generals, the old Bolsheviks who had helped Lenin, intellectuals, artists, anyone who might possibly be a threat.
The secret police, the NKVD, created a climate of absolute fear. They established quotas for arrests.
Quotas for arrests?
Yes. Local police chiefs had to arrest a certain number of enemies of the people per month, even if there were no enemies. So they just grabbed random people off the street.
People were afraid to speak freely in their own kitchens because their neighbors or even their own children might report them. It was a society of whispers.
But, and here is the really complex part, the gray area that our research points to, Stalin did achieve his goal.
The industrialization worked.
It did. In a decade, Russia transformed from a backward agrarian society into a massive industrial superpower. Literacy rates skyrocketed because the state needed educated workers. Women gained legal equality and entered the workforce in huge numbers, becoming doctors and scientists.
And when World War II came and the Nazis invaded, it was that heavy industry, the tanks, the steel, the railways that were built during the five-year plans that allowed the Soviet Union to survive and eventually defeat Hitler.
Precisely. Without that brutal, forced industrialization, the Nazis might have won the war in the East. So history leaves us with this very uncomfortable contradiction.
Okay, let's do a quick recap because that was a lot to process.
We started with a freezing night in 1917, with a population that was just crushed by autocracy and war.
That anger led to the spontaneous February Revolution, which got rid of the Tsar. But the new government failed to stop the war or feed the people.
Which opened the door for Lenin and the Bolsheviks to seize power in October. They won the Civil War, tried to force communism with war communism.
Which failed, so they pivoted to the more capitalist NEP.
And then Stalin took over. He ended the NEP and used brute force, terror, and central planning to turn Russia into a superpower, but at a staggering human cost.
Which brings us to our final thought. Stalin is famously and chillingly attributed as saying, "One death is a tragedy, 1 million is a statistic."
It's easy to look at the Soviet Union and see the factories, the rockets, the victory in WWII. But we have to ask you, can rapid progress ever justify the loss of freedom and the loss of life?
When we look at the industrial strength of the USSR, are we looking at a success story or are we looking at a crime scene? That is for you to decide.
Before we let you go, let's do a quick check your understanding. 3 questions to see if you were paying attention.
All right, question 1. To get the support of the people in 1917, Lenin used a famous 3-word slogan. What were those 3 things he promised?
Think about what the people were most desperate for. The answer is peace, land, and bread.
Question 2. Why did Lenin's policy of war communism fail so badly?
Remember the farmer logic we talked about? The answer. It took all the surplus grain from the peasants, which removed any incentive to work hard, and that caused famine and economic collapse.
And finally, question 3. What was the main #1 goal of Stalin's 5-year plans?
Think about what he was so afraid of regarding the West. The answer. Rapid industrialization, building up heavy industry like steel and electricity to catch up with the advanced countries.
That's it for this deep dive. History is rarely black and white. It's usually a very messy gray. Keep looking for those gray areas.
Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.